The shuttle landed on a platform carved into white stone, and Sergeant Colamarin stepped out into air that tasted like copper and wet leaves. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and built like a coiled spring wrapped in scar tissue. She carried nothing but a small bag, and the look of someone who had already decided how every room she entered could be used to her advantage. Ithara 7 stretched out before her in every direction, a world of towering alien jungle, rivers that glowed faint blue at night, and creatures that screamed in frequencies that made teeth ache. The Galactic Confederation had built the Verdance Institute here for one reason. This planet did not care if you lived or died. Every 50 cycles, one candidate from each member species was chosen to enter its wilderness alone, and survive for 30 days. They called it the melding trial, and species across the galaxy considered it the highest test of biological worth. Kala was the first human ever selected. She walked through the Institute's arched halls, and felt 40 pairs of alien eyes track her like she was something strange, dragged in from the rain. The other candidates were impressive in ways that made her feel like a plain brown moth among butterflies. A Thessari candidate named Lyriel stood near a window, her enormous bioluminescent wings folding and unfolding slowly, like breathing silk. She could photosynthesize, actually pull energy from light through her wing membranes. A Vrelian candidate demonstrated his camouflage by pressing his hand against a stone wall and watching his entire arm shift color until it vanished completely. A Jorath with arms thick as tree trunks, flexed claws that could tear metal, and boasted natural immunity to almost every known venom. Kala had none of these things. She was a baseline human. No wings, no camouflage, no venom resistance, no natural armor. She had brown hair tied back tight, steady hands, and a pair of eyes that never stopped moving. The opening ceremony took place in a vast amphitheater open to the sky. Senior Instructor Valeth stood at the center, and Kala had to admit that the Sari Elder was something to look at. Valeth was ancient and enormous, their wings spanning nearly 4 meters, glowing with soft patterns of gold and violet. They moved with a grace that made the air itself seem to step aside. Their voice carried without effort, warm and deep and certain. "You have been chosen," Valeth said, "because your species believes you carry the best of what they are. But here on Ithara 7, what you are does not matter. What matters is what you become. The wilderness before you is not an enemy. It is not a puzzle to solve or a battle to win. It is your mother, and you have been away from her for too long." Valeth's wings spread wide, casting soft light across the candidates. The melding is the oldest truth. The boundary between self and world is an illusion. You must let that illusion fall away. Become invisible. Become silent. Become part of the breath of the world. Do not impose. Do not resist. Dissolve. And in dissolving, survive. This is the melding. This is the way. The candidates responded with gestures of respect from their various cultures. Kala simply watched and listened. She kept her face neutral, but behind her eyes, she was doing what she always did: sorting, filing, planning. Each candidate would receive the same equipment: a single blade, a canteen, a basic fire-starting tool, and the clothes they wore. No technology, no communication devices, no maps. The wilderness would provide everything else, or it would kill them. During the orientation week that followed, Kala stayed quiet. She attended every lecture on Ithara 7's biome: the predators, the flora, the weather patterns, the toxic zones. She sat in the back and took no notes because she did not need to. She remembered everything. That was not a figure of speech. Kala had an eidetic memory, sharpened by years of Terran frontier ranger training, where forgetting the color of a particular fungus could mean dying in the night. She watched the other candidates practice their survival techniques, and she learned something important about every single one of them. They were all planning to hold still. The Thessari would find a grove and enter symbiotic trance. The Vrelian would camouflage and wait. The Jorath would find a cave and endure. Every strategy she observed was some version of find a spot, blend in, and ride it out. Nobody was planning to move. Nobody was planning to build. Nobody was planning to hunt. On the fourth day of orientation, Lyriel the Thesserai found Kala sitting alone on a balcony overlooking the jungle canopy. Lyriel was curious in a way that felt genuine, not condescending, not clinical, just honestly interested. She folded her wings and sat beside Kala with a grace that made the simple act look like poetry. "Have a question," Lyriel said, "if it is not rude. Go ahead. Every species here has a biological advantage for wilderness survival. The Vrelian has camouflage. The Jorath has strength and venom immunity. My people can feed on light itself." She paused, her wings flickering with soft patterns of curiosity. "What is yours?" Kala looked out at the jungle for a long time. The canopy moved like a green ocean under wind, and somewhere, far below, something roared. "We do not stop," Kala said. Lyriel tilted her head, waiting for more, but Kala just left it there. The night before deployment, Senior Instructor Valith requested a private meeting with Kala. They met in a small chamber lit by living moss that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Valith studied her with compound eyes that saw far more than visible light. "I sense something in you, Candidate Marin," Valith said. "A tension, a readiness that is the opposite of what the melding requires. You are coiled like a gun, creature about to strike." "I am just prepared," Kala said. "Preparation is not the same as control. The jungle does not reward those who try to control it. It swallows them." Valith leaned closer, and their voice became gentle. "You must surrender. You must let the wilderness hold you the way water holds a stone, completely, without resistance. Can you do this?" Kala met those ancient compound eyes and nodded. "I understand," she said. She did not say she agreed. The next morning, 40 candidates were loaded into individual drop pods and launched to separate zones across the deep wilderness. The pods were simple, a one-way door, a soft landing system, and nothing else. When the pod opened, you were alone. Kala's pod punched through the canopy and settled into a clearing surrounded by trees so tall their tops vanished into mist. The air hit her like a wall, hot, thick, alive with sound and smell, and the electric hum of a billion organisms. Do. She stepped out, the door sealed behind her. She did not meditate. She did not close her eyes and feel the breath of the world. She did not try to dissolve the boundary between self and wilderness. Instead, she dropped to one knee. She pressed her fingers into the dark soil and rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger, feeling its moisture and composition. She brought it to her nose and smelled iron, decay, and something sharp that might be chemical defense from root systems. She looked up and scanned the tree line, noted the game trails worn into the undergrowth, the claw marks on bark 8 feet up that meant something large passed through here, the direction of water based on the lean of moisture-loving plants. Her eyes went cold and calm and very, very focused. "Okay," she whispered to herself, "what here can I eat, and what here is trying to eat me?" The monitoring center of the Verdance Institute sat deep inside the mountain, a vast room filled with floating holographic screens that showed live feeds from every candidate's zone. 40 screens on the first day, 40 lives unfolding in real time across a planet that wanted to chew them up and spit out their bones. Instructor Dorvan stood with his thick arms crossed, his stone-colored scales catching the blue light of the displays. He watched the feeds the way a butcher watches livestock, with professional interest and very little sentiment. Beside him, Senior Instructor Valith drifted between the screens, their great wings trailing soft light, their compound eyes reading data most beings could not even perceive. The first few days went exactly as expected. Lyrael the Thessary found a grove of phosphorescent trees within hours of landing. She pressed her palms to the bark, and her wings spread wide, and slowly she entered symbiotic trance. Nutrients through her wing membranes, feeding on the light of the glowing trees, while her breathing slowed to almost nothing. She became part of the grove, beautiful, still, and perfectly melded. The Vrelian candidate found a riverbank and pressed himself against it. His skin shifted and rippled until he was indistinguishable from the wet stones around him. He lay there motionless, letting insects crawl across him, letting the water lap at his edges. The ecosystem accepted him because he gave it nothing to reject. A Jorath candidate found a deep cave and settled into it like a boulder. His massive body could go weeks on stored energy, and his venom immunity meant most of the dangerous creatures in the cave simply left him alone. These were textbook examples of melding. Minimize your presence, adapt passively, become invisible by becoming harmless. Let the world forget you are there. Valith watched these feeds with quiet satisfaction. This is how it should be done, they murmured. Surrender to the greater system. The ego dissolves, the world provides. Then Valith turned to screen 37, Kala Marin's feed, and their wings stopped glowing. Kala had not sat still for a single moment since her pod opened. In the first 6 hours, she had walked a 3-kilometer loop around her drop zone. And she had not been wandering. She had been surveying. Every few minutes she stopped, crouched, and studied something: a track pressed into mud, a broken branch at a specific height, a cluster of insects gathered on a particular type of bark. She used her blade to carve small notches into trees, each one angled differently, each one meaningless to anyone but her. She was building a map inside her head, and she was marking it in the real world with a code only she could read. By day 2, she had identified 3 water sources, ranked by reliability. She had cataloged which plants the local herbivores ate, which meant those plants were safe or at least non-lethal. She had found and tested soil in 6 locations by smell and texture. She had tracked the movement of something large through the undergrowth and determined it traveled east in the morning and west at night. By day 3, she started building. But she did not build a nest in the canopy like the Thessari. She did not weave herself into the environment. She dug a shallow trench beneath a massive fallen root system, reinforced it with packed earth and branches, covered it with layers of broad leaves and living moss, and positioned it so that anyone or anything approaching would have to cross her sightline first. Dorvan leaned forward and squinted at the screen. "That is not a shelter," he said slowly. "That is a hunting blind." On day 4, the traps began. Kala had spent her first days collecting materials, long, flexible vines that she twisted into cordage by rolling them against her thigh. Straight branches she sharpened with her blade. Heavy stones she positioned with care. She had watched which trails the small herbivores used, and where they slowed down to feed. She had noticed which crushed insects produced a scent that attracted those herbivores. Now she put it all together. She built snares using bent saplings and vine triggers. She built a deadfall using a flat stone propped on a stick mechanism so sensitive that a creature nudging the bait would bring 20 kilograms of rock down on itself. She dug a pit along a game trail, lined the bottom with sharpened stakes, and covered it with a lattice of thin branches and leaves. Valith watched this with visible discomfort. Their wings had dimmed to a troubled gray. "She is not melding," they said quietly. "She is imposing herself. She is reshaping the environment to serve her needs. This is precisely what the trial is designed to move beyond." Dorvan shrugged his massive stone shoulders. "The trial rules say survive for 30 days. They do not say how." Worked. By day 6, Kala had caught 3 small herbivores, She field-dressed them with her blade, stripped the useful parts, and buried the waste far from her camp. She built a fire, but not on the surface. She dug what the monitoring team later learned was called a Dakota fire hole, a design from ancient Earth, where the fire burned below ground level, with an air channel feeding it from the side. It produced heat and cooking capability with almost no visible smoke and a minimal thermal signature. Root, boiling and concentrating the sap into a thick paste, and coated the tips of sharpened wooden stakes with it. She had invented poison weapons in less than a week, using materials the planet provided. "She is not surviving," one of the junior instructors said, staring at the screen. "She is establishing a military position." By day 9, Kala began actively hunting. She had identified the apex predator of her zone, a 6-legged creature the size of a large wolf that the instructors called a vraska. Fast, strong, armored with chitinous plates, equipped with jaws that could crush bone. But Kala did not hunt it to kill it. She hunted it to learn it. She tracked the vraska for hours. She found where it slept, where it drank, what paths it preferred. She noted what times it was active and what times it rested. She mapped its territory by following its scent markers, scratches on trees, urine deposits, fur traces on rocks. She was reading the vraska's life like a book, building a complete behavioral profile of the most dangerous thing in her area. "She wants to know its schedule," Dorvan said with something that might have been admiration. "She wants to operate inside its territory without a confrontation. And if a confrontation comes, she wants to win." On day 10, the argument that had been building among the instructors finally broke into the open. Valith called a formal review of Kala's performance. Their position was clear. Kala was failing the spirit of the melding. She was treating the wilderness as an enemy, as a resource to be exploited, as a problem to be dominated. This was everything the trial was supposed to transcend. Dorvan disagreed. "She has more food stored than any 3 candidates combined. She has a secure shelter with fallback positions. She has weapons. She has detailed knowledge of her environment. She is thriving. Not just surviving, thriving. Tell me which of your melders can say the same." Valith's wings flared bright with agitation. "Survival without philosophy is just violence in slow motion. And philosophy without survival," Dorvan replied, "is just a beautiful corpse." The argument was still raging when a technician interrupted with a voice that had gone thin and strange. "Instructors, we have lost candidate Marin." Every head turned. The technician pointed at screen 37. It showed jungle, trees, ferns, the slow drift of alien pollen through shafts of light, but no Kala. The thermal overlay showed nothing. The motion sensor showed nothing. The biosignature scanner showed nothing. One moment she had been crouched beside her fire pit. The next, she was gone. Dorvan cycled through every sensor mode available: infrared, ultraviolet, electromagnetic pulse detection, acoustic triangulation. Nothing. The screen showed an empty jungle, as if no human had ever been there. Valith stared at the screen, and their wings went completely dark, an involuntary, Thessary response to fear they had not felt in 300 years of teaching. The human had vanished. And somewhere in the green darkness of Yathara 7, Kala Marin moved through the undergrowth like she had been born there, invisible, silent, and utterly in control of a world that did not yet understand what had crawled into its belly. Panic did not come naturally to Instructor Dorvan. His species, the Kreth, were carved from patience the way mountains are carved from stone. But standing in the monitoring center on the morning of day 11, watching technicians scramble across 40 sensor arrays and finding absolutely nothing on screen 37, Dorvan felt something uncomfortably close to panic scratching at the inside of his chest. "Expand the drone net," he ordered. "Double the sweep radius. Add 2 more units to her zone." "Already done," the lead technician replied without looking up. 4 additional drones deployed since last night. Full spectrum sweep, thermal, electromagnetic, acoustic, chemical trace, nothing. She is simply not there. Valith stood at the back of the room, their wings folded tight against their body like a cloak. They had not spoken since the previous evening. Their compound eyes reflected the glow of 40 screens, but they only stared at one. The empty green feed of Zone 37. Protocol was clear. If a candidate could not be monitored, they should be extracted for safety. But Dorvan hesitated. There was no distress signal. Kala's emergency beacon, a small subcutaneous implant, still transmitted a basic life sign pulse. She was alive. Her heart was beating, her body temperature was normal. But everything else was dark. She is not injured, Dorvan said. She is not lost. She has simply made herself invisible. He turned to Valith. How is that possible with no technology? Valith finally spoke, and their voice was very quiet. Because she studied us the way she studied the Vraska. It took the monitoring team 3 full days to piece together what Kala had done, and they only managed it by reviewing archived footage frame by frame, going all the way back to day 1. The drones that monitored each candidate were marvels of Confederation engineering. Small, silent, equipped with every sensor type known to galactic science. They were designed to be undetectable, but not to a human. On day 2, the archived footage showed Kala pausing mid-step and tilting her head at a very specific angle. She held perfectly still for 11 seconds, her eyes narrowed, her jaw slightly open. Then she moved on. 2 hours later she did it again. Same head tilt, same pause, same direction of focus. She was listening. The drones emitted a faint electromagnetic hum, so low that no known species in the trial could perceive it. But human hearing, the team learned, operated on a range that overlapped just barely with that frequency. Kala could not hear the drones exactly, but she could feel something. A pressure in her inner ear, a buzz in the metal fillings of her back teeth, and she had spent 3 days triangulating their positions by that sensation alone. Once she knew where the drones were, she watched them. She tracked their patrol routes, the way she tracked the Vraska, with patience and obsessive attention to detail. Attention to pattern. Over the course of days 4 through 9, she mapped every drone's flight path, timing, sensor sweep direction, and blind spots. Then she disappeared into those blind spots. But avoiding detection was only half of it. The drones also used thermal imaging, and a living human body radiated heat like a small furnace. Kala solved this problem the same way she solved every problem, with the materials at hand. She mixed the paralytic root paste with thick river mud and coated her exposed skin. This was not random experimentation. She had noticed on day 5 that animals smeared with similar mud compounds were harder to track on the Vraska's thermal-sensitive snout. She reasoned that if mud could mask heat from a biological predator, it might mask heat from a machine. She was right. Over that mud layer she built something the instructors had never seen before, but that Dorvan later learned was called a ghillie suit. She wove local ferns, hanging moss, bark strips, and living vine tendrils into a loose covering that broke up her silhouette completely. When she crouched motionless in undergrowth, she was indistinguishable from the jungle floor, visually, thermally, and electromagnetically. She had become invisible, not by dissolving into nature the way the Melders did, but by engineering invisibility from scratch, using sticks and mud and her own relentless mind. She reverse-engineered our entire surveillance network, Dorvan said, and he was not sure if the feeling in his chest was horror or Haman. Admiration. With Stone Age tools. Free from observation, Kala escalated. During days 11 through 15, the monitoring team caught only fragments, a brief thermal flicker here, a displaced branch there, a snare that appeared overnight in a location previously empty. These fragments told a story that grew more unsettling with each passing day. She was expanding. Not just surviving, expanding. She established a second shelter 2 kilometers north of her original position, then a third shelter at a higher elevation to the east. Each one was camouflaged, fortified, and stocked with dried meat, water containers, and weapons. She dug water collection pits, lined with broad waxy leaves that channeled morning condensation. She processed plant fibers into rope strong enough to hold her body weight. She built a short bow using a flexible hardwood branch and twisted sinew from her kills, and she fashioned arrows tipped with the paralytic compound. She was not enduring the wilderness, she was colonizing it. Meanwhile, the other candidates told a different story. The melding approach worked, right up until the moment it did not. Yathara 7 was not a gentle place, and beings who made themselves passive and small were exactly the kind of thing the jungle ate. A candidate from the fragile amphibious species was extracted on day 8 after a severe allergic reaction to local spores. The Jorath, who had seemed invincible in his cave, was ambushed by a pack of smaller predators that attacked his eyes, the one place his armor did not cover. He survived, but was pulled out blind and screaming. 2 more candidates were extracted for psychological collapse. One, a species that absorbed emotional imprints from its surroundings, had been overwhelmed by the constant predatory aggression of the jungle's psychic background noise. It had gone catatonic, drowning in the forest's hunger. Lyrael the Thessary was still thriving in her symbiotic grove. Beautiful, serene, perfectly melded. But she had not moved more than 200 meters from her landing site in 16 days. She was part of the forest in the truest sense. She had given up mobility, territory, and agency in exchange for harmony. Kala had given up nothing. On day 16, the monitoring team caught something that none of them would ever forget. A drone swept through the Vraska's territory on a routine pass, and its thermal sensor caught a 2-second flicker, a human-shaped heat signature inside the Vraska's den. Inside the den. The footage was grainy and brief, but unmistakable. Kala was crouched less than 3 meters from the sleeping apex predator, wrapped in her ghillie suit, utterly motionless. The Vraska, a creature that could disembowel a Jorath, did not stir. Its nostrils flared gently in sleep, and it showed no alarm whatsoever. She had spent days acclimating the predator to her presence, approaching a little closer each time, letting her scent become part of the den's background, letting the Vraska's ancient instincts classify her as furniture rather than food. She had not tamed it. She had simply made it forget she was dangerous. One of the junior instructors whispered what everyone was thinking. She did not become one with nature. Nature does not know she is there. On day 19, the team detected a pattern they had missed before. Across 3 different zones, someone had been breaking branches and displacing stones in a way that looked random, but was not. Dorvan ran the data through a spatial analysis program, and his scales went pale. It was a trail network. Kala had blazed a system of paths across a significant portion of the trial zone, each one marked with her private code of angled notches and displaced stones. She had mapped the jungle on foot, without instruments, and when the monitoring team overlaid her trail markers onto their own orbital survey, they found that her map was more accurate in several areas than theirs. She had outsurveyed a satellite with her feet and a knife. On day 22 she appeared. One of the drones was running a standard sweep, when Kala simply stepped into its field of view. She stood in a small clearing, her ghillie suit draped over one shoulder, holding a freshly caught animal carcass in one hand. She looked directly at the drone, directly into the lens, as if she knew exactly where the camera was, and gave a small, deliberate nod. Then she turned and walked back into the undergrowth, and was gone within 4 steps. Dorvan burst out laughing, a deep rumbling sound that startled everyone in the room. He laughed because there was nothing else to do. The human had just announced, without a single word, that she knew they were watching. She knew they had lost her, and she was choosing to let them see her for exactly as long as she wanted, and not 1 second more. Valeth did not laugh. That evening Valeth convened a formal philosophical review in the senior chamber. Their wings burned with troubled light as they paced before the assembled staff. The melding teaches that the highest expression of survival is harmony, Valeth said, to reduce friction with the ecosystem until the boundary between self and world disappears. This human has demonstrated the opposite. She has not reduced the boundary, she has expanded the self. She treats the ecosystem as raw material, not with cruelty, not with waste, but with a competence that I can only describe as terrifying. She does not harmonize, she adapts and exploits and controls. And I must confess to you all, it is working better than anything I have seen in 400 years of teaching this trial. The room was silent. Dorvan pulled up the survival metrics on a central display. Of the original 40 candidates, 19 remained. Most were static, enduring, melding, holding still, and hoping the jungle would not notice them. The only one gaining weight. She was the only one expanding territory. She was the only one whose stress hormones had actually decreased since the trial began. She was not surviving the jungle. She had made the jungle survive her. Dorvan looked at Valeth and said it quietly, with no triumph and no mockery, just the honest weight of what they were all watching. You told her to become one with nature. I think nature became one with her. Valeth's wings flickered once and went dark. Kalan noticed it before the monitoring center did. She was crouched beside one of her northern cache sites, rewrapping smoked meat in fresh leaves, when the insects went silent. Not quiet, silent. Every buzzing, clicking, humming thing in the canopy shut its mouth at the same instant. And the jungle held its breath, like a child who has just seen something terrible. Kala looked up. The light filtering through the canopy had shifted from its usual green gold to something darker, a bruised purple that pulsed faintly at the edges. She could feel pressure building in her inner ears, not the subtle hum of the surveillance drones, but something massive and deep, like the planet itself, was grinding its teeth. She did not know the word for what was coming, but she knew what silence meant in a jungle. It meant everything that lived here was already hiding. She abandoned the cache and moved fast, not running, because running in dense jungle was how you broke an ankle and died. Moving with the focused speed of someone who had mapped every root and stone in her territory. She headed uphill toward her highest shelter, the one she had built on an elevated ridge precisely because the ridge could not flood, and the rock overhang could not collapse. In the monitoring center, 300 kilometers away, the first alarms began to sound. Convergence event detected, a technician announced, their voice tight. Electromagnetic surge building in the southern hemisphere. Magnitude is... They paused and checked the reading twice. Magnitude is beyond any recorded event in Institute history. Dorvan was at the central console in 3 strides. Time to full onset? 4 hours, maybe less. The storm front is accelerating. The convergence was Uthara 7's apocalypse season, an irregular electromagnetic superstorm that disrupted animal behavior, triggered massive insect swarms, caused flash flooding in every lowland zone, and drove predators into blind terror. Territorial frenzy. It was a known hazard of the trial. The Institute could not predict exactly when it would hit, and they could not stop it. Their job was to extract candidates who were in immediate mortal danger, and let the rest prove they could survive the worst the planet had to offer. But this convergence was worse than any on record. The electromagnetic readings were off the scale, and the storm front was moving faster than the models predicted. Valeth appeared beside Dorvan, their wings rigid with alarm. How many candidates are in flood zones? 14. At current projections, 6 will be underwater within 8 hours. Begin emergency extractions for the 6 most critical. The next 12 hours were chaos. The convergence hit like a fist. The sky turned black, and the jungle screamed. Not metaphorically, the electromagnetic surge caused certain plant species to vibrate at audible frequencies, producing a sound like 1,000 voices wailing in harmony. Rain came in sheets so dense, it was like standing under a waterfall. The rivers swelled and burst their banks in minutes, turning lowland zones into churning brown lakes. For the candidates who had melded, who had made themselves part of the ecosystem, the convergence was catastrophic. They had dissolved their boundaries with the world, and now the world was tearing itself apart and taking them with it. Lyrael's symbiotic grove flooded in less than an hour. The trees she had bonded with were submerged to their lower canopies, and the sudden change in water chemistry broke her photosynthetic trance like a slap. She woke gasping, disoriented, chest deep in rushing water, her wings waterlogged and useless. She barely managed to claw her way up to a higher branch before the current would have swept her away. 3 candidates were swarmed by insects, billions of creatures driven into frenzied migration by the electromagnetic chaos, forming living clouds that choked airways and covered exposed skin. The extraction teams pulled them out, half suffocated and covered in bites. 2 more were attacked by predators displaced from their territories. A Vrelian candidate who had spent 20 days perfectly camouflaged against a riverbank was trampled by a stampeding herd of panicked herbivores. His camouflage meant they did not see him, and that was no longer an advantage. 7 candidates were extracted in 48 hours. The monitoring center was a hurricane of shouted orders and emergency coordinates. And through all of it, Screen 37 showed exactly what it had shown for the past 2 weeks. Empty jungle. But this time, it was not because Kala was hiding. It was because she was already safe. Her methodology had been built from the ground up on a principle that the melding philosophy did not teach: redundancy. She had not placed all her survival in one location. She had not committed to a single strategy, trusted the jungle to remain stable, because she had never trusted the jungle at all. She had 3 shelters at different elevations. Her highest was above any possible floodline. Her food caches were sealed in bark containers and distributed across multiple sites, so that losing one did not mean losing everything. She had mapped drainage patterns during her first week and knew which valleys would flood and which ridges would stay dry. She had stored water, so she would not need to approach swollen rivers. When the convergence hit, Kala simply relocated to high ground, sealed herself into her reinforced shelter, and ate smoked meat while the world came apart outside. The ghillie suit kept wandering predators from detecting her. Even her scattered traps worked in her favor. Panicked animals blundering through the jungle stumbled into her snares and deadfalls at a higher rate than during calm weather. She was not just surviving the catastrophe, she was profiting from it. On day 25, with the storm still raging, Kala did something that no one expected. The monitoring team caught a brief thermal signature moving through the storm-battered jungle, heading south, away from Kala's safe territory, and directly toward one of the most devastated zones. Dorvan tracked the flicker as it moved with determined speed through flooding undergrowth and fallen trees. "That is Marin," he said. "She is heading toward Lyrael's zone." Vayleth's wings flared. "Lyrael's beacon has been showing erratic vitals for 6 hours. We classified her as stable enough to remain, but—" "She is not stable," Dorvan said, pulling up the Thessary's readings. "Body temperature dropping. Wing membranes are damaged. She has not moved from her last position in 4 hours. She may be trapped." How would Marin know that? Dorvan had no answer. But Kala kept moving south. What the monitoring team did not know, what they would only learn later. Kala had noticed something during orientation week. The Thessari had bioluminescent wings, and those wings left a faint chemical trace in the air wherever they went. Most species could not detect it, but Kala had spent a week memorizing every scent in the Institute, and she had catalogued Lyriel's chemical signature the way she catalogued everything, automatically, permanently, without even deciding to. Now, in the storm-wrecked jungle, she was following that trace like a bloodhound. She found Lyriel 2 hours later. The Thesserai was pinned beneath a fallen tree in a depression that was rapidly filling with floodwater. Her right wing was torn badly, the bioluminescent membrane shredded and dark. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were closed. The water was up to her chest and rising. Kala did not hesitate. She found a thick branch, wedged it beneath the fallen tree, braced a stone as a fulcrum, and threw her entire body weight onto the lever. Much, but enough. Kala grabbed Lyriel under the arms and dragged her free. And the Thessari was heavier than she looked, dense with the strange biology of her species. Kala's boots slipped in the mud, and her shoulders screamed, but she did not stop, because stopping was not something humans did. She hauled Lyriel to high ground, a rocky outcropping above the floodline, and built a shelter over her in the driving rain, using fallen branches and her own ghillie covering. She treated the wing tears with a poultice made from plants she had catalogued during her first week, packing the wounds with crushed antiseptic leaves and binding them with clean vine strips. She built a small fire in a rock crevice and kept it burning through the night, feeding it with dry wood she had cached nearby, because of course she had cached dry wood nearby. She had cached everything, everywhere, against exactly this kind of emergency. Lyriel woke near dawn. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Worst of the electromagnetic chaos had passed. She found herself warm, dry, bandaged, and alive, lying beneath a makeshift shelter with a small fire crackling beside her, and a human sitting cross-legged at the entrance, watching the jungle with those restless, calculating eyes. "You saved me," Lyriel said. Her voice was weak, but steady. "You were in trouble," Kala said, as if this explained everything. "We are competitors. You gained nothing by helping me. You could have stayed safe." Kala was quiet for a moment, feeding a stick into the fire. "You were kind to me on the first day," she said. "You sat with me, when no one else would, and you asked me a real question like I was a real person. I remember things like that." Lyriel stared at her. "You crossed a storm and risked your life because I was kind to you once." "Yes, that is insane." Kala almost smiled. "That is also part of it." In the monitoring center, Valith watched the feed, with tears tracking down their angular face, not because the rescue was emotional, though it was, but because of what it revealed. Kala had saved Lyriel with the exact same competence she used to hunt and trap and vanish. The same cold efficiency, the same tactical precision, the same refusal to accept circumstances as given. She was a predator who had chosen to protect instead of kill. And the terrifying thing was that she used the same skills for both. They stayed together for 3 days while Lyriel recovered. Their dynamic was strange and wonderful. Lyriel taught Kala things, the subtle biochemical language of the forest, which spore clouds meant safe air and which meant poison, how root networks communicated stress signals between trees. Kala absorbed it all with hungry attention, filing it away in that perfect memory. In return, Kala taught Lyriel how to build a snare. Lyriel was horrified and fascinated. She held the vine trigger mechanism and stared at it like it was a bend. "Sacred artifact from a violent god. Do all humans think like this?" she asked. "See the world as components to be used?" Kala considered the question honestly. "We see it as a puzzle," she said, "and we really like solving puzzles." On day 28 the storm broke. The jungle steamed and dripped and began the slow process of rebuilding itself, the way it had done 1,000 times before. Lyriel was strong enough to move, her wing already regenerating with the slow magic of Thessary biology. The trial rules required them to finish separately, so they prepared to part. Before Lyria left, she asked one more question. Kala, were you ever afraid during any of this, even once? Kala looked out at the wrecked jungle, the shattered trees and flooded valleys, and displaced predators still prowling in confused aggression. She looked at the world that had broken 2/3 of the candidates, the world she had been dropped into with a knife and a canteen and nothing else. Every single second, she said. That is the secret. We are always afraid. We just do it anyway. She pulled her ghillie suit over her shoulders and walked into the green and was gone within 3 steps. Lyria watched the space where she had been and felt her wings flicker with an emotion she had no Thessari word for. A mixture of awe and unease and deep, complicated affection. No wonder the galaxy is nervous about them, she said to the empty clearing. The jungle buzzed around her, already forgetting the storm. It would not forget Kala. The extraction shuttles came on the morning of day 30, descending through the canopy on columns of quiet light, and settling into the designated clearing like silver birds returning to a nest. One by one the survivors walked out of the jungle, 11 beings from 11 species, the remnants of 40 who had entered. Most of them looked like the jungle had chewed them up and only barely decided not to swallow. Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, trembling limbs, skin marked with bites and scratches, and the deep exhaustion of creatures who had spent a month trying very hard not to die. They had melded, they had endured, they had survived by becoming so small and so still that the world had mostly overlooked them. Lyriel emerged from the tree line, with her wings still partially bandaged, but held high. Her time in the storm and the days after had changed her. There was a sharpness in her eyes now, an alertness that had not been there before. She was thinner, but she walked with strength, and when the Institute medics rushed toward her, she waved them off with a gesture that was almost human. The other survivors gathered in the clearing, and the medics checked vitals and administered nutrients, and the instructors made notes on their datapads. The mood was one of quiet relief. They had made it. They were alive. The trial was over. Then someone said, "Where is the human?" Heads turned, eyes scanned the tree line. The clearing went still. Kala Marin walked out of the jungle last. She did not stumble. She did not look thin or exhausted or relieved. She walked with the same measured, watchful stride she had used every day since the pod doors opened. Her eyes sweeping the clearing out of pure habit before she allowed herself to relax even slightly. She had gained weight. Her arms and shoulders showed new functional muscle, built from weeks of climbing, digging, hauling, and bow hunting. Her skin was tanned dark and marked with small scars from thorns and branches, but nothing serious. She wore boots she had crafted herself from cured animal hide, fitted and stitched with bone needles and vine thread. Over one shoulder, she carried a handmade pack constructed from woven bark fiber. Inside it, and the instructors would catalog this later with a mixture of disbelief and something close to reverence. She carried 12 strips of smoked meat, a coil of braided cordage strong enough to support twice her weight, her short bow, and 6 paralytic-tipped arrows, a clay water vessel she had shaped and fired in a pit kiln, a collection of medicinal plants wrapped in leaves, and a set of bark strip maps covering the entire trial zone, drawn with charcoal in her private notation system. She looked like she could turn around and walk back into the jungle for another 30 days without breaking stride. Dorvan checked her vitals and went very still. "She is in better physical condition than when she entered," he said to Valeth. "Resting heart rate has improved. Her cortisol levels are lower. Her muscle mass has increased." He looked up. The jungle made her healthier. Valeth said nothing. Their wings glowed with a complex pattern no one in the room could read. The formal assessment hearing was held that afternoon in the Institute's great chamber, a circular room with walls of living wood that breathed and pulsed with the slow rhythm of the planet. Traditionally, these hearings were quiet ceremonies where each candidate described their experience and the instructors offered gentle wisdom. The candidates before Kala spoke of stillness, acceptance, the beauty of dissolving into something larger than themselves. Then it was Kala's turn, and the chamber was packed to the walls. Word had spread through the institute. The instructors, the support staff, even candidates from previous trials who maintained connections to the academy. Everyone wanted to see the human who had vanished from every sensor, who had hunted the hunters, who had crossed a superstorm to save a stranger, who had walked out of 30 days of alien wilderness looking like she owned the place. Valith led the questioning. They stood at the center of the chamber, their wings spread in formal display, their voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of accumulated wisdom and tradition. Candidate Marin, Valith began, you were instructed to meld with nature, to become part of the ecosystem, to dissolve the boundary between self and world. They gestured and holographic footage appeared in the air. Kala building traps, hunting, constructing her ghillie suit, vanishing from surveillance, crouching in the Vraska's den. You did none of this. You imposed upon the ecosystem. You manipulated it. You dominated it. Valith's wings pulsed with formal challenge. How do you answer? Kala stood. She was clean now, wearing standard-issue clothes, her hair still pulled back tight. She was the shortest person in the room, by a considerable margin. She looked up at Valith without defiance, but without apology. Instructor, she said, with respect, I did exactly what you asked. The chamber rustled. You told me to become one with nature, but you assumed that meant becoming passive, becoming something that is tolerated, something so small and so harmless that the ecosystem forgets it exists. She paused. That is how your species relates to wilderness, and it is beautiful. I watched Lyrael bond with a grove of living trees and turn light into life, and I have never seen anything more graceful. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. But it is not the only way. She took a step forward, not aggressive, just present. Humans are nature too. We did not arrive from somewhere outside of it. We evolved in wilderness, just like every species in this room. Our ancestors lived in jungles and grasslands, and frozen tundra, and burning deserts. And they survived, not because they had venom, or armor, or wings, or camouflage. They survived because they learned. They watched, they remembered, they adapted, and they built. Her voice was steady, almost quiet, but every being in the chamber was listening. When I set a trap, I am doing what a spider does. When I hunt, I am doing what a wolf does. When I build a shelter, I am doing what a bird does. When I stockpile food, I am doing what a squirrel does. The only difference is that I can do all of those things, and I can switch between them, depending on what the situation demands. She looked at Valith directly. I did not step outside of nature. I used every part of it, the way my species has for 300,000 years. I did not fight the ecosystem. I studied it, I learned its rules, and then I used those rules better than anything else in that jungle. She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was softer. You told me you lost me on day 10, that your sensors could not find me. Disappeared. Something almost like a smile crossed her face. Instructor, is that not the deepest melding of all? When your machines could not tell me apart from the jungle itself? When the apex predator of that biome slept 3 meters from me and did not know I was there? Was I not more completely part of that world than someone sitting in a trance in a grove? The silence that followed was so complete that the breathing of the living walls could be heard, slow and deep, like the lungs of a sleeping god. Dorvan was grinning. He could not help it. Valith's wings flickered through a dozen colors, surprise, discomfort, recognition, and finally something that looked like the Thessari expression for a truth you did not want but could not deny. They lowered their head in a gesture older than the Institute itself. The candidate passes. Velith said, but they were not finished. I wish to add a formal note to the record, Velith continued, and their voice had changed, dropping into the register reserved for observations of historical weight. The human candidate did not meld as we understand melding. She demonstrated an alternative paradigm, one in which the sapient being does not dissolve into the ecosystem, but instead absorbs the ecosystem into itself. Their wings spread to their full 4-meter span, blazing with light. She did not become invisible by being harmless. She became invisible by being so competent that the environment could not distinguish her from its own apex processes. This is not melding. This is something older, and I confess, more frightening. They looked around the packed chamber. I recommend we study it. I recommend we respect it. And I recommend with all the weight of my 400 years that we never ever make it our enemy. The chamber erupted, not in argument or protest, but in the low, thunderous hum that 100 alien species produce when they have just witnessed something they will be talking about for the rest of their lives. After the hearing, when the crowds had thinned and the formal ceremonies were complete, Lyrael found Kala on the same balcony where they had first spoken, the one overlooking the endless jungle canopy. Kala was leaning on the railing, watching the green ocean move under the wind, and for the first time since Lyrael had known her, she looked relaxed, not alert, not calculating, not scanning for threats. Just a person looking at something and finding it good. I am going to petition my government, Lyrael said, folding her wings and standing beside her, for a formal exchange program with Earth. Kala raised an eyebrow. What kind of exchange? Not technology. My people have spent thousands of years learning to dissolve into the world. Yours have spent thousands of years learning to reshape it. Neither is wrong. But I think the galaxy needs both perspectives, and I think they need to learn from each other. That might be the smartest thing anyone has said during this entire trial. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Kala said, "Come visit Earth sometime. I will take you camping." Lyrael tilted her head. Is that the thing where humans voluntarily go into wilderness for recreation? Yes. The wilderness that you also treat as a tactical problem? Kala considered this. Yes. Lyrael's wings shimmered with the color that meant bemused affection, a shade Kala had learned to recognize over 3 days of sheltering together in a storm. Humans are insane, Lyrael said. Kala grinned. It was her first real grin, full and open and bright, and it transformed her face from something watchful and guarded into something warm and startlingly young. That is also part of the secret, she said. They watched the jungle together as the sun moved across the alien sky, and the canopy swayed like a great green sea, alive and ancient, and utterly indifferent to the small, bright creatures who walked upon it and tried, each in their own way, to call it home. 3 days after Kala's shuttle lifted off from Ithara 7, the automated planetary survey system flagged an anomaly in the trial zone. In the area where candidate Marin had operated for 30 days, the local Vraska population had shifted its territorial boundaries. Their new patrol routes curved around her former campsites, her shelter locations, her hunting grounds, avoiding them completely, the way animals avoid the territory of a predator they have learned to fear. The apex predator of an alien world had learned in just 1 month to stay away from the places where a human had been. The monitoring team stared at the data. Dorvan laughed his deep stone laugh. Velith's wings went dark. And somewhere far away, aboard a shuttle bound for Earth, Kala Marin slept peacefully for the first time in 30 days, dreaming of green and gold and the sound of a jungle that would remember her name long after the last footprint faded, because nature always remembers its own, especially the dangerous ones.